On Ball State today, we'll discuss with our guests how far we've progressed in genetic research and some of the misconceptions associated with genetic research. We'll also talk with a specialist about student publications and their responsibilities. And you'll meet the highly talented Tretick family who performed with the Muncie Symphony Orchestra. Dr. Tom Mertens and Dr. John Hendrix, Ball State biology professors, conduct workshops on genetics for high school biology teachers each summer. Gentlemen, what are some of the ethical implications in the expanding field of genetics?
I'll let John field that
since
this is his special interest.
Does the public have some misconceptions?
Oh, the public has a great many misconceptions about it. You can tell that by kind of the titles of books that have been published, like Algeny, Are We Playing God? That kind of thing. And I think that creates a lot of ethical problems, but what scientists are really doing in the field of genetics is trying to generate knowledge, very basic, fundamental knowledge about how organisms develop, how organisms function. The knowledge base that has been generated right to date has been used by scientists and by engineers, bioengineers in reality, to try to alleviate serious genetic defects in human beings, to try to alleviate food problems, and to try to alleviate energy problems. Now, I think most people would classify that as being good utilization of knowledge. The alarm that's been raised, and raised in many specters, including the scientific community themselves, has been an alarm that I think is not called for at this time, because all knowledge can be used for both good or evil. And it's up to society to make those choices of how knowledge is going to be used.
That would lead me to my next question, Tom. In medical profession, correcting genetic diseases through research, there's been some apprehension, but medical professions said they are very close to resolving some of those problems.
Yeah, I'd like to say that there are probably over 3,000 genetic diseases known that affect human beings. And I think that one of the misconceptions in the public is that genetic disease is a relatively rare thing. I think individually genetic diseases are rare. Maybe 1 in 10,000 babies born with genetic disease X and 1 in 50,000 with some other. But collectively, all of these diseases are an important part of our health problem today. And so, as you've indicated, there are attempts being made to try to actually cure genetic diseases. At this point, we'd have to say that there are no cures for genetic disease. But by some of the new molecular biology techniques of recombinant DNA or similar procedures, it may be possible to correct some single gene defects in the not too distant future. And John and I were talking about this before as to some of what those diseases might be. Sickle cell anemia, perhaps. We mentioned Lesch-Nyhan syndrome.
Cystic fibrosis.
Cystic fibrosis, which
Duchenne's muscular dystrophy.
Cystic fibrosis is the most common lethal genetic disease in the white population in the United
How
States.
close are we to?
Well, there's talk that this could come at any time, that at any time the procedure may be initiated to attempt the first cure.
And even when you use the word cure, you might jump on that.
Yes, I think
because
so.
In reality, we are treating, but a very elaborate treatment method.
That's
that
right.
We would hope to change the genes in the body cells so that they manufacture the proper enzyme or protein. But in effect, we wouldn't be changing the genes in the sex cells, the gametes.
So that the person would still transmit the defective gene if that person subsequently had children. If we cured cystic fibrosis in the sense that we made this person well, this person would still be carrying the defective gene for cystic fibrosis, which
So
he
you're
or
not
she
going to
could
eliminate
transmit.
it within that
Not going to
individual.
eliminate it by the kinds of procedures we're talking about at the present time.
But that is an aim, I'm sure, and a goal.
Well, ultimately, it would be a desirable thing to have happen, of course, and
Each,
most of our points of view. And
of course, a complete cure.
that's right.
Each summer you conduct workshops for high school biology teachers, in effect teaching teachers about genetics.
That's right.
What is the purpose of the workshops?
We have several goals in the workshops. Genetic health problems are now being ranked within the top 3 health problems. cardiac problems, cancer problems, kidney problems. If you look at deaths now, we're looking at deaths that all are intertwined with our genetic constitutions. Decision-making and appropriate decision-making on the part of all responsible citizens is going to be taken only if they have the right knowledge. Human genetic knowledge, then, is needed by high school biology teachers to disseminate to high school students. They need that because many of them will never go on any farther than high school. They need to be able to understand the impact of this new field on all of our lives and the information that's gaining, and it's significant.
Back in the 70s, a group of authorities working at the biological science curriculum study in Colorado recommended that if we were to have any impact on educating the public about human genetics and genetic diseases, that we needed to initiate that with high school biology instruction. And it was at that time that John and I became involved in running these workshops for teachers in the summer of 1978. And
now we have, what, 240?
We've trained 240 teachers in this
And we have a national network established across the United States of outstanding biology teachers, like Presidential Award winners, NABT Award winners, which is the National Association of Biology Teachers, the ex-president of whom is on my left.
Good.
And we're seeing the impact because these teachers are out training their colleagues, other teachers.
As well as their students.
As well as their students.
And that's the important.
And that is...
that's the multiplier.
That's a real multiplier
effect.
effect.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Okay.
Dr. John Hendrix and Dr. Tom Mertens, professors of biology at Ball State University, enlightening us on genetics. Mark Goodman, director of the Washington Press Law Center, a journalism speaker for the observance of the 4th Annual Freedom of Campus Student Press Month, talked with us about freedoms and responsibilities of high school and college newspapers. How do university administrations handle the issues of these student publications?
It varies. You know, it can be very different from school to school. I would say for the most part schools are very interested and conscientious about protecting their student publications. First Amendment rights. Very few schools actually do censor, and those that do are the exception rather than the rule. There are a few schools that tend to be very sensitive when their student publications publish stories that are controversial or stories that are critical of the university and its officials or individuals in the community, and they sometimes react in ways that I think are inappropriate in that they try to curtail that kind of expression in their student publications. But as I say, those schools, I believe today, are in the minority, definitely, and most schools are very willing to let their students write about whatever they want to write about and let them know that the law is going to be a limitation on them, and they are the students as well as the university is bound by the law.
Are there many legal cases pending against student publications?
There are a few. I would say at this point there are probably about 7 libel suits that are pending against both high school and college publications, threatened libel suits at this point. That's a relatively small number when you consider the number of high school and college publications there are in the entire country. It doesn't even compare with the number of similar suits brought against professional publications. There are more lawsuits at this point that are brought by students or their advisors against public universities or public high schools because they feel that their First Amendment rights have been denied. At this point, I would say that there are probably 15 or so cases of that nature that are actually in the courts right now.
Have any of these cases been resolved?
There have been many cases that have been resolved in the past, and cases are resolved, you know, as the weeks passed. It's a continuing process. What the courts have decided in the cases that have been dealt with is that because at public schools the administrators, the teachers are employees of the state technically, that they are limited by the First Amendment to our Constitution in controlling student expression in their student publications. When an administrator or a teacher at one of these schools tries to censor the student publication, they are held to a very high burden, and they are required to show before they can censor that a material and substantial disruption of the school environment would occur if they were not to censor that student publication.
Do you think that many of the problems associated with student publications and the ensuing lawsuits could come from the inexperience of those writing the stories?
In some situations, I think that's correct, but I must honestly say that inexperience oftentimes doesn't account for the lawsuits that result. I think more often what accounts for it is university or college or high school officials and administrators who are a bit too quick to act when they become distressed over something they see in their student newspaper. Student journalists, considering their age, I think are an incredibly responsible group of individuals. Not to say they don't make mistakes, and not to say they don't act irresponsibly in some situations, but I think the lawsuits, for the most part, are not the result of their irresponsibility.
There are various ways to control publications without appearing to be dictatorial. What are some of those?
There are a lot of ways, and I think today more we're seeing these subtle kinds of control more than the blatant kinds. For example, one way that I think is frequent and somewhat understood is control of editorships, or the control of funding, more importantly, being willing to cut off funding or control funding to student publications according to how they feel about the content of that publication.
Is this what we commonly hear as the chilling effect?
Exactly. It's equally censorship in a court's mind as if you had gone in and confiscated copies of the newspaper. They see this kind of cutoff of funding, etc., as censorship just the same, and it really can have just as detrimental effect on the publication as more blatant forms of censorship.
Before coming to Ball State to speak, were you aware of the student publication, the Daily News, and the School of Journalism?
I was, yeah, very much, because at the Student Press Law Center, several members of our board of directors are Ball State alumni or currently are involved with activities here at Ball State, and I knew that they had a good publications program and were very strong supporters of the First Amendment rights of students.
Do you have advice for publication editors?
I would think, yes, I do. I've always got advice. I'm a lawyer. My advice to them, I think, would be to, number one, the most important thing is always to try to look at things from their administrators, their advisors, their teachers' point of view. That's one thing I think students sometimes don't take the time to do, and that can avoid a lot of problems. But that's only my first bit of advice. My second would be to feel confident in standing up for their rights when their rights have been taken advantage of. I think that they are doing more for themselves, more for their school, and more for the country, for that matter, if they're willing to commit themselves to the principles of free expression and the idea behind the First Amendment. And in the long run, it's going to be in everyone's best interest if they stay committed to that principle or are willing to fight for what they believe in.
You know, the publication of a daily newspaper in Muncie, Indianapolis, Chicago, you have a chain of command. You have your reporter, you have your various editors, and editor-in-chief, and then you have your publisher. Is the chain of command similar in a student publication, and where does that chain of command end?
Okay, where it ends or where it differs from a daily newspaper in a city, any kind of professional publication, is that the editor ultimately is in control of the student newspaper. To the same extent the editor of a daily city newspaper is in control. But oftentimes school officials tend to look at themselves as the publisher of their student newspapers, and they feel that they can exercise control over the publications to the same extent that a publisher of a daily city newspaper could. The fact is that's not the case, as the courts have seen it, that because at a public school the school administrators are employees of the state, are essentially government officials, they are not allowed to exercise the kind of content control that a normal publisher would be able to exercise. That's what the First Amendment was intended to prohibit against, to keep government officials from controlling what thoughts people read or wrote about. So that means that the line stops there. In a student publication, really the editor is the one who must make the final decisions about what goes in or what doesn't go into the publication.
But you might get into a situation where the editor of a student publication, be it high school or university, could be underage, could be of the age of 17, 18, or 19, and not legally accountable.
Well, that's oftentimes that's never been an issue in any of the cases that has been brought up at this point, in that if a student actually has, acted inappropriately in a certain situation, they have been held responsible for their actions, and the courts haven't made any distinction on the age of that individual.
On the whole, in my final question, would you say that student publications are healthy and progressive?
I think publications are healthy and they're progressing to a certain extent very slowly, but I think the threats against the student press are as strong now, if not stronger, than they ever have been, and I think it takes continued vigilance against these threats against them to continue to have a strong student press. And I think the bottom line is we're not just talking about the student press here, we're talking about the free press rights of all journalists in this country and the free expression rights of every citizen. And when you start chipping away at the free press rights of student journalists, the ultimate result is going to be a little less free speech rights for us all.
That's right. Infringement on one is infringement on all.
Yeah, exactly.
Muncie Symphony concert goers were recently treated to a rare musical performance by Patricia Tretick, Ball State Professor of Musical Performance, and her 5 children. We talked with Mrs. Tretick about her talented children. We talked with her son, Clifford Tretick, who was performing a specially composed work by Ball State Professor Ernesto Pellegrini. The Tretick family, accompanied by Nelson Paget at the harpsichord and Dr. Philip Albright on bass, performed the 3rd movement of the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 for our enjoyment. Mrs. Tretick, how often do you perform with your children?
Very rarely, unfortunately. I wish I could see them oftener, and we certainly welcome this opportunity because we are playing together and we are together. And I think the last time we were together to play and just simply to be together was 2 years ago, when we purposely took a summer festival engagement in Lake George, New York, so that we could spend 6 weeks together.
Is there a competitiveness among your children for performing?
I don't think so. No, I don't ever feel that there is any. They're adults and they're out in the world and they're playing and very busy and very active with their music, and I don't think so.
Tell us about each of them. Briefly, the instrument they play. I noticed 4 play strings and 1 plays one instrument.
Yes, my oldest daughter is Stephanie. She is a violinist, but she is a violist with the Pittsburgh Symphony, where she's been for 5 years, and before that she was in Baltimore for 5 years as a violinist. She's very active in chamber music there, and is also active in the orchestra on a managerial basis. She's on 3 important orchestra committees. She was on tour with the orchestra this last summer, and will go again next year to Japan with them. Blythe, my second daughter, is a cellist. She's associate principal cellist with the Pittsburgh Symphony. And with her husband, Lowell Adams, who's also a cellist, they're very avid chamber music performers also. She plays a very interesting modern instrument, a Carl Becker cello. They love living in Phoenix because they like the Southwest so much. They like Indian lore and have an Indian collection of Indian artifacts. Let me see. Clifford, the flutist, the only member of the family who is not a string player, and he's very happy that he isn't, is attending Ball State at the present time, working on a master's degree, and he is also playing many concerts. He recently was soloist with the Polish Chamber Orchestra in New York. Noelle, my youngest daughter, lives in Indianapolis, where her husband is a physician. She's teaches at Anderson College, plays quite often with the Indianapolis Symphony, plays with the Muncie Symphony, and just recently played a recital at Anderson College. Drew is the youngest son. He's home from Juilliard at the present time, where he attends school, and will finish probably next year. So that takes care of them. He's a violist.
It must give you a great deal of pleasure to see your children perform and be able to perform with them.
Oh, of course. I'm very interested in what they're doing, and I follow their careers with enormous interest, of course, because I'm a violinist, and it is the family business. My husband was a fine, marvelous performer. He was at Ball State for 10 years before his death, and he was concertmaster of the Muncie Symphony, as many people know.
Clifford, we singled you out of the 5 children to talk to because you are going to perform an original piece with the Muncie Symphony Orchestra.
Yes, I am.
Tell us about it.
The work was written by Ball State's own Dr. Ernesto Pellegrini, who's on the faculty here at Ball State, of course, composition teacher. And he approached me, I think about a year and a half or so ago, and I think it was at a social engagement of some sort, and he mentioned the fact that he might be interested in writing a piece for flute and orchestra. Well, it turned out that he did, and it's for alto flute, which is a larger instrument than this. It's about this much longer, and it's much larger. Round instrument has a deeper sound and lower pitch. And the piece is based on some Italian folk melodies, Sardinian melodies, and its reminiscences from his childhood when he lived in Florence, Italy during World War II.
Sounds like it would be bright and lively and very
well, at times, but it's a very, very powerful work, in that he lost a family member during that bombing raid. When the Germans were bombing Florence, and one of the shells fell in his backyard and killed some children and a family member. So it's very close to his heart, I'm sure, and it's a very serious work. And it does incorporate some Gregorian chants and things, and he's now at peace with himself. And he chose the flute because of its melodic character. And I'm totally delighted to be able to work with a composer so close at hand, because we don't always have that luxury. Bye.